Hi there. Welcome to my channel, Fill PCI SAQs yourself. And today we're going to talk about the differences between service providers and merchants in the context of the PCI DSS standard. Oftentimes, I have heard about companies, asking this question basically, am I a service provider or am I a merchant? And, while everyone can interpret it differently, the PCI DSS has, their own definitions, and today we're going to talk about those two. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I have the PCI, SSC's website open with me. So we can obviously we can of course directly search from here, but let's go to resources here. And so on the resources you'll see the glossary. So I'm looking for the PCI SSC glossary. Okay, so there, if you just click on M, if you can just do, like a control F or a command F depending on your operating system, to search for merchant. But you can also, kind of just scroll down a little bit, and the definition of merchant is available here. So let's read this a little bit. Let's dissect this a little bit. For the purposes of the PCI DSS, a merchant is defined as any entity that accepts payment cards bearing the logos of any of the 5 members of the PCI Security Standards Council. Okay, so those include American Express, Discover, JCB. It's a Japanese, card brand, in case you're not aware. A MasterCard and Visa as payment for goods and or services. So again, a merchant is defined as any entity that accepts payment cards, and those payment cards could be, as mentioned in one of my earlier videos, could be debit cards or credit cards issued by any of these card brands. Okay, as payment for goods and or services. So those could be physical goods, or those could be, services like online hotels, for example, or, online taxi services, taxi booking services, or online reservation systems for, restaurants, for example. So it could be anything. Note that a merchant that accepts payment cards as payment for goods and or services can also be a service provider. So, a company can be both, basically, both a merchant and a service provider. So if a company categorizes as both, then they'll have to fill in the SAQs for both the merchant and the service provider. So that's, just how it works. If the services sold result in storing, processing, or transmitting cardholder data on behalf of other merchants or service providers. Okay, for example, an internet service provider is a merchant that accepts payment cards for monthly billing from customers, for example, but is also a service provider if it hosts merchants as customers. So again, let's say I'm an internet service provider. If I accept credit cards or debit cards issued by these 5 card brands from my kind of, customers, and those could be retail customers like, you and me, or those could be enterprise customers, like companies, for example. So I am a merchant in the, within the context of the PCI DSS. But then if, let's say, I also offer hosting as a service, since I'm an internet service provider, and let's say, if I host, let's say other merchants. So let's say if I host another company, hosting meaning, website hosting, let's say. So if I host another company that accepts payment cards, just like me, then, I would also be called a service provider in the context of the PCI DSS. Okay, so then, just think about it yourself. So if you are a company which accepts payment cards in the form of, credit cards or debit cards from any of these 5 brands, from any customer, be it like, like an end user, like a retail customer like you and me, or an enterprise customer like, Google, Microsoft, etc., then you are defined as a merchant in the context of PCI. So, that's basically how you need to look at it. Oftentimes, people get confused with this, is because I'll give you an example. So let's take an example of Uber, for example. Again, taking it just for example purposes. So if you look at it from, like, a traditional merchant or service provider kind of definition, so Uber, even though it does provide the option for, credit card payments, it can be considered like, outside of PCI DSS, it can be considered as a service provider because it does not own any of those, it doesn't own any, taxis. It doesn't own any cars. So, it's just a conduit between the taxi drivers and the travelers, right? Now, the passengers. Now, in the traditional sense, Uber could be considered a service provider, but in the context of PCI, since it accepts credit card payments, from the end users, and also from maybe the drivers, for kind of accepting commissions from them. Uber, for example, again, this is just an example, would be considered a merchant in the context of PCI. And a service provider could be, let's say, so note that a merchant that accepts payment cards as payment for goods and services can also be a service provider. Uber's example, might not fit into a service provider. To understand the definition of a service provider, let's go into the definition of the service provider separately. So for that, we'll have to go to S here. So let's say we go to the definition of service provider. You see, a business entity that is not a payment brand directly involved in the processing, storage, or transmission of cardholder data on behalf of another entity. Okay, so a service provider is basically a business and like a business entity that does not directly store, process, or transmit cardholder data. Okay, and again, cardholder data implies credit card or debit card data. This could also include companies that provide services that control or could impact the security of cardholder data. Examples include managed service providers that provide managed firewalls, intrusion detection systems, and other services such as hosting providers and other entities. So again, so let's say, I'm a cybersecurity company and I manage the firewalls in your company, right? And that firewall in your company, let's say, is used to, let's say, control traffic for systems that are in scope for PCI DSS. Okay, so I am a service provider in the context of PCI DSS to your company. So I am liable to be PCI DSS compliant as well because I am providing my services to your company, kind of as a service provider. Okay, again, if an entity provides a service that involves only the provision of public network access, such as a telecommunications company providing just the communication link, the entity would not be considered a service provider for that service. Okay, so although they may be considered as a service provider for other services. So again, it's very broad. Again, this is just an example. What they are saying is that in the earlier example, right, the firewall literally impacts the security of cardholder data in your environment, right? And I, as a managed security service provider, I am managing that firewall for you. So I become a service provider because it impacts the security of cardholder data. Okay, see the highlighted thing. But then if it's like a public network access telecommunications line, it does not directly touch the cardholder data environment that your company hosts, then I'm not eligible to be a service provider in this case. So again, breaking this down into easily digestible terms, when should you consider yourself as a merchant in the context of PCI DSS? If your company directly accepts, stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data from any of those 5 card brands: American Express, MasterCard, Visa, JCB, and Discover, for providing goods and or services, you are a merchant. Okay, what's a service provider? If you are providing services to another merchant, and if you impact the security of cardholder data, that merchant might store, process, or transmit in any way, shape, or form. So those are the 2 ways you can think about whether you could be considered a merchant or a service provider in the context of PCI DSS. That's it for this. Thank you so much for watching my videos. I look forward to seeing you again in the future videos. Thank you. Bye.